All right. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to our, I believe this is number 6 and final installment of our FarmOps series. We're happy to have you aboard. We know that it's really, really nice out, and for July, having a day like this is just amazing. So thank you for choosing to be with us when I know that we both know that it would be really nice to also be outside. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen really quick to share our presentation. Let's see here. There we are. So tonight's presentation, if you haven't joined us before and have heard this already, this is a partnership between the Cornell Small Farms program called FarmOps and the Southwest New York Dairy Livestock and Field Crops program. With the support of FarmOps, we were able to get some equipment to take some really cool videos for you all. So tonight, our presentation not only is going to be informational, but we'll also have some demonstrations, particularly on hoof trimming kits, what to keep in them, as well as hoof trimming demonstrations themselves. Cornell Cooperative Extension's Southwest New York Dairy Livestock and Field Crops program is a partnership between Cornell University and the 5 county associations of Allegheny, Cattaraugus, Chautauqua, Erie, and Steuben. And together we're able to bring science-based information from the university out to the farm. So we're really excited to be part of that organization. Before we get started tonight, just our small disclaimer that this information is for educational purposes only. We are prepping you with the tools to make decisions on your farm. But for those legal and medical decisions, we request that you seek out professionals who are trained specifically in that area to help get your questions answered. So without further ado, we'll introduce our presenters tonight. I'm going to go second. So Caitlin, would you mind going first, introducing yourself?
Absolutely. So hi, everybody. My name is Caitlin Wally-Stoll, and I'm our program's Farm Business Management Specialist and Team Leader. So I work with farms on paperwork, profit, and people management. And I'm really excited to be here tonight. On a personal note, I do have my own diversified livestock farm where we actually raise goats. So that's we're here to bring you both research and real life experience when it comes to this topic. So really happy to be here and happy to answer any questions that you might have as we go along.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. And my name is Amy Barkley. I'm the livestock and beginning farm specialist for our team. I do anything related to the production management of our major livestock species, including poultry. I also deal with meat marketing, product quality and consistency and management, and also grazing management. On our personal farm, we have a diversified operation. We don't have goats. We do have a wide variety of poultry and produce and fruit crops that we have, as well as a small apiary. So all right, so we're going to get started now into goat herd and foot health. My half of the presentation is going to involve more of the goat herd health side of things, and Caitlin's going to be more of the foot health. As we go forward, if you have questions, don't have goats yet. Yes, Caitlin, that is very true. So as we go forward, if you have questions, please feel free to just go ahead, toggle over that bottom bar at the bottom of your screen and pop them either in the chat or Q&A. And we'll get to answering those as we go along, because we know that questions, as they pop up, they're most likely related to the topic that we're discussing. So more than happy to do that. You are muted and your videos are turned off for the start of this presentation, just because of the webinar format that we're in. So please utilize the chat and Q&A to ask questions. Thank you so much. So for tonight's agenda, we're first going to start to think about how we can manage our herds for optimal health. And then I'm going to list and outline and show photos of common diseases that goats can get. Then we'll take our break. And as I had shared, we will go through then Caitlin's section, where she will discuss preparing hoof trimming kits and give that hoof trimming demonstration that I know that we're all here for. So our poll system's down right now, but I do want to ask this question. Please feel free to type it in the box, the chat box. Oh, it works.
Yes, we're good to go.
Miracle worker. All right. So for this first poll, there's two questions. The first is, what is your experience with goats? You might already have them in your garage. You're pretty close to raising goats, but you're not quite there yet. You want more information before you commit to raising them, or you signed up for the wrong webinar. And then the second part of this question is, have you joined us before? And if you have, you've probably seen this intro question 4 different times. So thank you for bearing with us there. So we'll just give a couple of moments here to answer the questions. Okay. All right. So we're going to go ahead and share the results here. So it looks like we've got folks, we're not raising goats yet, but we're either pretty close or we want some more information. So this is the perfect presentation for you. And okay, 2/3 of us have seen this before. So thanks again for bearing with us. Okay. When we think about disease in general, disease generally follows what's called the host pathogen environmental triangle. So on each edge of the triangle, we have one of those topics, and where they intersect and interact is how we get changes in the changes within the animal that can cause disease or wellness. It depends on how you look at this triangle. But generally, the host needs to encounter a pathogen in order to become ill, and the environment needs to be such that that animal can become ill for that animal to fall sick. So that's kind of how we think about things. So when we think about managing, we're not just managing the pathogens that we find, whether they be viruses or bacteria or parasites, but we're also looking to say, okay, what environmental factors have caused the animal to either get that bug or cause their immune system to decrease to get a bug, or something to that effect. There are multiple different definitions of types of diseases, and I'm just going to introduce these terms to you because on a lot of medical websites, university websites, you'll encounter them quite frequently if you're searching for disease. So the first is enteric. Enteric essentially means intestinal. These are things like coccidiosis, which live in the intestine, or barber pole worm, which they actually live in the stomach. Intestinal is kind of a general term. It just means anywhere in the gut. Respiratory is what you think it is, has to deal with breathing. So anything in the throat or in the lungs. So bronchitis and pneumonia are examples of disease that can occur there. And then we have the nervous system, which can be affected in many ways. Deerworm is one of those things that can cause the brain not to function properly. And so we'll see things like lameness or weakness in the back end. Something else that could go under here is something like milk fever, where the body just cannot function properly. So that we'd also consider that a nervous disease. And then we have infectious and non-infectious. So some of these diseases I'm going to share tonight are infectious, but there are quite a few that are non-infectious. So these are things like nutritional deficiencies. So in our area, for instance, in New York State, Western New York, the Northeast in general, we have low levels of selenium in our soil. So it's possible that we may need to supplement those through salts and other things to limit nutritional deficiencies. Then we have chemical and toxic plant poisoning, which is kind of self-explanatory. So you might have goats that eat something like a branch from a cherry tree that fell down during a storm the night before. That cherry tree branch, because it's dead and dying, has some arsenic in it that affects the goat in a nervous sort of way, a nervous sort of disease. And chemicals will react the same way. There are hereditary defects, so things like cleft palate. So while that is considered, it's not a causative organism, it does cause disease within the animal, whether that be malnutrition or whether that be pneumonia from respirating milk by accident. There are unknown causes of non-infectious diseases. Something dies or gets sick and we just can't pinpoint why that is, even with the great medical minds of veterinarians with us. And then there's also poor husbandry practices, which can affect some things. So let me think. So for instance, something like foot rot, true foot rot. It could be because you have the organism in your environment, but it could also be because the pens of your goats are not kept as dry as they could be, which then creates this pathway for the organism to get in. So these are infectious and non-infectious diseases. So when we think about how these affect our animals in terms of least severe to most severe, generally the body is going to give up things in a specific order. So reproduction is generally the first thing that goes. If the animal's not healthy, if there's something wrong, it won't cycle and it won't produce offspring. Mostly you see this in females. It has to be pretty severe in males in order to have decreased reproductive capacity. The next is decreased productivity. So just say the animal, you have a doe and she's feeding some bucklings and doelings. She might decrease the amount of milk she puts out as well as an effective disease. Then you have things like market loss. So an animal that is just really not fit to go to auction, looks really skinny and not thrifty, just not doing quite right, might be lame, that sort of thing. And then we move into things like quarantine and vet visits. So those animals which have disease that is highly contagious, perhaps, and is spread out to multiple animals very quickly, somewhere where you need to call a vet in to evaluate and help determine a course of treatment. And finally, the most severe is animal loss. So losing that animal completely to whatever disease they have. All right, so let's go into common goat diseases. There's well, let me get there. I'm not quite there yet. So before I get into diseases and list them individually and discuss symptoms and things, I want you to think about your herd that, well, a herd at home, if you have one at home. So that we have somebody who just joined us, or maybe a herd that you've seen, or maybe something that you've read. Do you have any familiarity through those experiences with goat diseases? And if so, can you name them? And if you know, just go ahead and pop your answers into the chat box. I'm just curious to see what kind of information, where we are as a group for our baseline. So I know how much and how in depth to discuss on each of these topics. Okay, so Zachary says he's dealt with coccidiosis in chickens, and indeed you can deal with coccidiosis in goats and lambs. Yep. Okay, Walter has no familiarity. That's absolutely fine. That's why we're all here today. Okay, just give that a couple more moments here. Oh, yeah, foot rot's a little terrifying, but the good news is once you eradicate it from your herd, as long as your management practices are up, you'll be able to keep it down. Yes, Caitlin, 100%. Okay. Well, it sounds like we have a little familiarity with some things and not a whole lot with others. So let's get into this a little bit more. So I didn't include foot rot on this list because we're talking about foot health in about 20 minutes here. But what I am including are other diseases. So we have 2 columns here. And on the left-hand side, these are the ones that you're probably going to encounter as a goat owner. The ones on the right-hand side are those that are more devastating, but less common. Most of the times these are tested out of herds from which you would get seed stock from. So you don't need to worry about them too much, but it's good to have an idea of what they are. So if you encounter them, you say, okay, I need to practice biosecurity. Okay, that animal will go into my herd. Or okay, my herd has it. I'm not going to go ahead and sell those animals until that's cleared up. So on the left-hand side, the most common are things like internal parasites. So all goats have internal parasites. We did a whole lecture on that a few weeks ago. And I have a link to that a little bit further on in the presentation if you haven't seen it. Coccidiosis, so Zachary, what we were discussing before. So the cocci that affects chickens and the cocci that affects goats is a different strain, but goats and sheep can actually share some strains. So that's something to keep in mind. External parasites, so things like mites, lice, spot flies, respiratory disease, and pink eye. And on the other side, we have things like sore mouth, caseous, lymphitis, Johne's, and CAE, which is caprine arthritis encephalitis. I'll start with internal parasites, and I'm not going to belabor this because we do have this outlined pretty thoroughly in our pasture health and management recording. But we want to keep in mind things like barber pole worm, deerworm, and meningeal worm. Internal parasites are picked up from the environment from animals consuming forage that's infected with either infective larvae or infected feces of animals who were infected before them. And it's really, really easy to transmit. Usually the whole herd's exposed. And we just need to take preventative measures, most times for internal parasites, to determine the level of infection and to treat that before it gets too severe. Also, to take steps to make sure that we're not treating in a way that results in the resistance of these parasites to those drug tools that we have in our toolbox. And so things like FAMACHA, which is that diagram on the right-hand side, can help us determine levels of anemia, for instance, for barber pole worm treatment, and help us make decisions as to whether or not we treat to prevent those resistance issues further on down the line for our herds. Coccidiosis is next. Well, I should back up and say internal parasites affect basically any type of goats, any age of goats. Of course, there are predisposing factors as to those who will be more susceptible. Generally, and this is true for all diseases, those that are most susceptible are usually very young, very old, or they have an immune compromising challenge. That could be pregnancy. Where the immune system is down a little bit, allowing these things to take hold. So back to coccidiosis. So coccidiosis is a single-celled parasite that is obligate. So that parasite needs a host to survive. It's found in warm, damp environments. It's passed from animal to animal through the feces. It's essentially picked up by the animal consuming forage off the floor, so having contact with that feces. If you're feeding up in hay racks, you generally don't have as much of an issue with this, but for those animals that nibble off the ground, this is a greater concern. Generally speaking, it takes about 21 days for the little cyst that's pooped out to become infective and actually cause damage inside of the animal. And so therefore, when you have kids hit the ground, generally it's around 3 weeks of age that we start seeing issues. So when they start nibbling around their environment, testing out the forage in addition to mama's milk, where they start picking up the single cells of this parasite, and then they start replicating in the body because they don't have a really high immunity yet to the cocci organism in the environment, and then they'll get sick. And what this bug does is it lives in the intestinal lining. So it's obligate, it has to live inside an animal, but it just decides to burrow in the lining. And as it does so, it damages the cells there that regulate the flow of nutrients into the bloodstream. And if not treated immediately, once you start seeing symptoms, usually those animals are goners. So we want to make sure that we monitor for this and treat for this. The good news is as these animals grow, they will develop natural resistance to coccidiosis. So it's not very common that older animals will come down with it. Okay, so now we have external parasites. Again, these are things like lice, mites, fleas, ticks, bots, and then things like face flies, horn flies, stable flies. So those flies that fly around and bother the animals during the summer. For those who aren't familiar with nasal bots, they're not super common, but they're common enough that they've made this list. What happens is there's a certain fly that lays her eggs up in the nasal cavity of sheep and goats. It hatches, it burrows in there, and then it causes some respiratory issues because that animal can't breathe all too well. And it's all irritated in there. So there's extra mucus production, maybe some sneezing, that sort of thing. And then ticks are self-explanatory. There are different ticks that we're looking out for now in the United States, like the Asian longhorn tick, which is making its way up north. And then most common, I think, is something like the lice, mites, and fleas. So this goat here on the right-hand side, perfectly healthy goat, but had a case of lice, and he was really, really itchy. And so he just rubbed himself along his cage bars, and you can see on the hog panel that's in front of him, all of his hair that is no longer on his body because he's itched it off. And generally for these guys, you're not going to want to treat for them unless the animal's in discomfort or the infestation reaches an economic threshold. And essentially what that is it's a threshold of the number of bugs per square inch or per animal that would cause you to treat for that bug. And there's publications that outline that. But for something like, we'll use lice, for instance. So in the case of lice, if you see 10 or more louse per square inch, then you'll go ahead and treat that animal, no matter if they're showing discomfort or not. And this way, we can help reduce the incidences of resistance for arachnicides or insecticides on our animals. All right, so now some of the less common one. Oh, no, this is a common one as well. Okay, pneumonia, respiratory illness. So usually this starts off as sniffles and sneezes, but it can develop into full-blown pneumonia. Young that end up breathing in milk can end up getting pneumonia. Basically, water in the lungs results in pneumonia. So there's bacteria or a virus that infects the lungs. It causes the production of mucus and things that gets aspirated, and then it just causes this nasty cycle of issues within the respiratory system. These are usually, in these cases, you'll see fever, difficulty breathing, you'll see some ocular, nasal, or oral discharge. Those systems are all linked, so you'll see that all together. And then the issue with this is not so much as that not only it can be contagious, but the major concern is that once an animal gets it, if it's not treated and cleared up quite quickly, it can result in something called failure to thrive, where the animal just doesn't grow, just doesn't put on weight, and it can also lead to death if it's severe enough. Okay, so I have a couple of questions here in the chat. So Zachary asks, how common are tick issues with small ruminants? I will say that it depends on the farm and where you live. So if you're living in an area that is more wooded, you might experience this more. I'm starting to hear of more and more issues on cattle. I haven't heard as much in the small ruminant world, and maybe that's just because of the rooms that I'm in. So Caitlin, I saw that you unmuted. I didn't know if you had something to add. Okay, no.
I was just going to echo the same thing. I don't think we have enough data right now to say like this is how common it is, because it's a newer issue, honestly. And it really depends on like flocks. So if you are actively using forested areas for your pastures, you're going to see it a lot more. The other thing though too is like, depending on your goat hair quality, that gives the goat some protection against the ticks actually latching on. So it really like depends on each flock from the folks that we've heard from, or each herd from the folks that we've heard from. So just monitor your goats. And if it does become an issue where you're finding a lot of ticks consistently, I would certainly reach out to your vet to see if there might be any off-label products that you might be able to use, other management activities that they can kind of help you through. And you could also start doing some testing of the ticks too. So when you send those ticks into test, a lot of times they'll come back with like, none of these common diseases exist. And in that case, that means that those diseases aren't within your tick population. So it's not a big deal. But as soon as you start getting a lot that come back positive for certain bacterial diseases, and that's when we're going to really want to work closely with our vet. And Amy, tell me if I said anything wrong, but that's kind of what I'm hearing as folks are calling in.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And so we're going to have a similar response to Bryce's question, where he asks, I'm planning on raising Angoras. Would I treat them for fleas, ticks, and lice earlier than on meat and dairy goats? And I don't, that's something that you should work out with your veterinarian. But the way that I'm thinking through it is that it's not necessarily that you treat earlier. And what I think you mean is a lower threshold of bugs. It's all going to depend on how those animals react and, what your general level of risk, how much risk you're willing to take on, right? So I would talk to a veterinarian and see what's going on, and also use your observation skills. Go out there, look at the animals, start keeping track of what your thresholds are for those animals to start wearing down their coats because of itchiness or what have you.
Yeah. I would just echo that from like economic threshold point of view. A lot of our economic thresholds are based on meat goats. So if you are raising goats for the intent of fiber, right, then the economic threshold is different. So you're trying to protect the quality and quantity of that fiber. So that would be a great conversation to have with your vet. Talk about, as soon as you start, for example, your vet might tell you, as soon as you start seeing clumps of hair lost, and that's when we're going to go treat, because that hair is what you're essentially harvesting. So it's going to be different, and there's not a ton of research on fiber goat management for those. What are those economic thresholds?
Right. Yep. Awesome. Thanks. All right. And then another question, we have hair sheep and field grazing, but have been curious if we should worry about ticks since we catch them on our pets. Like the idea of testing our ticks, we have a jar of them. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So happy for you.
Yeah. I would say start monitoring, right? So if you're getting them off of your pets, it would be interesting to see if your goats are picking them up too. And if you're starting to pick them off of your goats, then I would give your vet a call, and it costs, less than $10, $20, depending on what lab you use to test the ticks. And I think it's always worth to know what's the disease pressure. And even, as I said, like you might get one tick that comes back as positive for something out of 10 that you sent in. And in that case, your vet might say, oh, it's, maybe we're not going to worry about it as much. But once you start getting several coming back as positive for something, that's when your vet might step in with something else or some different type of management. Or you're just also going to be a guinea hen farmer and set those loose to roam with your goats too. So
a guinea hen and goat farmer. Man, yes. That'd be a fun farm.
Yes. But that's a really good point.
Yep, absolutely. All right. So now that we've covered all the common diseases, let's go to some of those less common ones that I talked about, the ones that, are pretty deadly and pretty devastating, but aren't super common. So sore mouth, this is the first one. So what this is essentially is it's a viral skin disease that likes to rest in mucous membranes. So, like around the eyes, around the sides of the mouth, where the leg of the animal meets the udder of the animal, on the teats, that sort of thing. And so these blisters are really sore, which is why they call it sore mouth. And those animals with sores on their faces, around their lips, have a hard time eating without pain. And so they might not eat they won't eat as much. Some may just stop eating other than enough to survive. And so you're going to have animals that lose body weight, animals that are young that are supposed to be growing that aren't growing well, maybe animals that just you want to get them bred, but they're not putting on body condition to get there. Some other issues that you might run into if you have this disease is that if you have dams nursing young, the young will try to nurse, but the dam is really sore and she just doesn't want any of that. So she'll reject her offspring. Maybe reject in the full definition of reject isn't the proper word, but she won't let them nurse because it's painful for her. Now, if you have milking goats and they have sore mouth around their teats and udders, they might be really not cool with you milking them, and they might react violently, whereas maybe they were really calm before. So keep a lookout for blisters around those parts of the animals. And if you have them, you can talk with your vet to determine how to best treat them. The next we're going to discuss is caseous lymphitis. And so lymph essentially refers to the limbic system, and we have lymph nodes all over our bodies. So when the doctor is feeling under your chin, there's lymph nodes there. There's lymph nodes in your neck. They're in your armpits, in your groin area. And these are areas of the body that kind of, they help move fluid through the body. They also help with regulating the immune response. And so what happens in this disease is the bacteria gets in there, settles in a lymph node, decides to have a huge party, and ends up creating an abscess at that infection site. So on that lymph node, it'll just grow and produce and die and cause a lot of irritation. And so an abscess will form that's full of pus. And what will happen is that abscess will come to the surface gradually over time, rupture, and then be this giant smorgasbord of infection for other animals. Sounds great, right? Yeah, it's not wonderful. So the issue with this is that you can enter conditions such as chronic wasting disease, decreased weight gain, decreased wool growth. So in part of this, it's because the animal's not feeling really good, so they're not eating. Lower milk production also follows that line of thought. Reduced reproductive capabilities because you can't get the body condition on those animals to cycle properly. And in the most severe cases, it can cause death. This is also one of those diseases that can spread to humans. So if you notice that you're starting to get some abscesses in the groin, armpits, front pits, back armpits of the goat, or in the neck, I would go ahead and get those tested to make sure it's not CL. And then if you interact with those animals, wash your hands really well before and close really well before interacting with other parts of your environment. Okay, so Johne's is next. Johne's is a disease that until I started working with goats, I thought was only a cattle disease, but it's a ruminant disease, and it's caused by a bacterium, and it gets into the animal system and causes essentially rapid weight loss and diarrhea. And these animals will still eat really well. They'll eat like any normal goat. They might even eat more than a normal goat. But the reality is once they're infected, they're not absorbing the nutrients they need to put on weight, to keep weight on. And so over time, these animals are going to waste away. And what really sucks about Johne's is that an animal can come onto the farm and it looks perfectly fine. And then over the course of many months or even years, it then starts to show symptoms. So getting animals from a Johne's free herd is a pretty good thing to consider if you're buying animals from an unknown source. If you know the source, you know that they don't have Johne's on their property, that's another thing that you can consider. Infected mothers can infect the offspring through the placenta. So during embryonic development, those babies can be affected, and those that are infected at some point in their lives will waste away and die. Okay, so the next one is caprine arthritis encephalitis, CAE. And what this is it's a virus. And it doesn't really have any particular symptoms, but these are a couple of the more common ones. So I want you to take a look at the left of these two pictures, and we see that the joints of this goat are pretty darn swollen. So that's part of like the stiffness, lameness symptoms that these animals experience. And then in the right-hand picture, we have a picture of a quarter on the left-hand side is swollen all the way down into the teat canal. And on the right-hand side, the quarter or that part of the milk bag is normal. And so mastitis can be caused by a lot of different things. It could be bacterial. It's probably bacterial when you get it, but it could be CAE. And if it happens to be CAE and there's a chance that you might have it, go ahead and get it tested to make sure it's not. But it can cause things like mastitis. It can cause pneumonia, inflammation of the brain, so they might act a little neurological. They might not act quite right, trouble breathing, coughing, difficulty, or they may not show symptoms. So this is one of those diseases that's pretty broad, and the only way to verify that you don't have it is to test for it. If you do have it, it is contagious. It spreads from infected mothers to kids via the milk, or from adults to other adults through contact. And so it results in low weight gains, decreased milk production, which, if you're milking, that's a negative for you. But if you're trying to grow really heavy weaned kids, that can also be a problem. And it can also cause death if it gets to that point within the viral cycle, in the viral cycle. The unfortunate part is there's no treatment available for this. So there are some management techniques that you can employ to help those animals that you have lived the best life, or you can go ahead and cull your whole herd and start again. And that's a conversation that you really have to have with a veterinarian, because it's not one that we take lightly, just because it can have such big consequences for your entire group of animals. All right, so when I was putting this presentation together, pink eye was one of those things I thought, it's pretty common. I should put it in more common diseases. But in sheep and goats, I really don't see a lot of pink eye. And again, that might be from what we discussed earlier, where there's not a whole lot of research out about it, but it does exist in there. So what pink eye is we're familiar with it. So bacteria gets into your eye and it causes runniness and your eye swells shut. And you sometimes go to the doctor for those drops for your eye to help make sure that there's no damage to your cornea, that sort of thing. And it's very similar for sheep and goats. So these animals are very uncomfortable. There's bacteria growing in their eye and it hurts. And so they're constantly blinking. And if there is injury to the eye, in addition to the bacterial introduction, whether that be through flies, like face flies biting in the corner of their eyes, or maybe they're running through some really tall pasture and the awns, so the little seed head pointy bits on grasses will rip past their eyes. Damage like that can result in the bacteria getting into the eye itself and causing different stages of vision loss in these animals. So the animal here in the center, has a moderate amount of vision loss. The animal in the bottom right, where the eye appears almost like a yellow pussy color, has full vision loss in that eye. This is easily transmitted from animal to animal. That's because it transmits on flies. And it also transmits from those animals touching with their mucous membranes, touching an area where another animal's been. So things like mineral buckets or feed troughs or a treat bucket, or maybe bridles or harnesses. You have animals that you use for show. So it's really important that if you start seeing this in your herd, go ahead and get it treated and isolate those animals that are infected, because it's hard to cure once you've got it. We don't have effective vaccines for it yet. We've been trying, but there's just not enough research done to get a vaccine to the point of where it's effective, because the different strains of bacteria are different by farm. And the biggest concern with these animals is that animals that can't see, can't eat, can't grow, and can't live a good quality of life. So we want to make sure that we get it treated early so that doesn't get to this point, and that we limit the number of animals that are infected if we have it started in our herd. All right, so those are all the big scary ones with ugly pictures, ugly scary pictures. So those are the ones that we want you to look out for. Again, they're not super duper common, but they do exist. I have seen them on farms around Western New York where I work. So they are around. Now, we also need to consider diseases that are nutritional or metabolic in nature. So we're just shifting gears a little bit from an infectious organism to an environmental thing that causes these animals to fall into a diseased state. So I've listed a couple here. These are ones that you are probably familiar with. So things like milk fever, which is essentially a metabolic disorder where they have low blood calcium. Pregnancy toxemia, which is either a nutritional and or metabolic disorder where they have low blood sugar and they can't, usually the females who are pregnant in their last trimester of pregnancy don't have the energy available to put into that growing fetus or put into high rates of milk production, so we can get pregnancy toxemia. Grass tetany, which is essentially where an animal goes out, grazes on really lush grass, and then keels over and dies. This is from improper magnesium calcium ratios in the forage. So this is relatively common in spring. White muscle disease, which is essentially a lack of selenium. Usually this affects young newborn kids, and we can manage around that. We have grain fever, which if your goat gets out, and I've had this happen when I was a kid and we were raising goats, they get into the grain bucket and they don't know when to stop and they just gorge themselves on grain. They end up with too much lactic acid being produced in the body, and the body just, normally the body is able to deal with lactic acid just fine. It's a normal part of the goat's digestive process. But if they eat too much grain, the body's like, oh my gosh, and it just ramps up really, really fast. And that amount of lactic acid overloads the body and can cause some issues. And then the final one is most common in male goats, but is urinary calculi, which is essentially a calcium stone that gets lodged in the urethra of the male goat. Usually, almost always requiring a veterinarian to come in and intervene and remove that stone or put that animal down. And it can be addressed with nutritional management. So there's a lot of these things out there. And again, ways that we can manage around them. But I just wanted to draw a few of those to your attention because we do consider them diseases. Okay, so now that I've listed all of these diseases and probably scared the living daylights out of most of you, and I hope I haven't deterred you from raising goats, but the reality is we can prevent most of this stuff through our environmental management of these animals. So the first thing that we can do is we can practice biosecurity, essentially keeping the bacteria or viruses or parasites that are at a farm, at an auction, at a swap, at a meet, at a breeder's facility, keeping them away from our animals. And the ways that we do this is making sure that we keep our animals separate from animals that we don't know the medical history of. When we introduce, when we have animals and maybe we're working with our neighbors' animals, we want to make sure that we wear clean boots in between their operation and our operation, or maybe we have dedicated boots that we wear to each operation, not sharing tools between operations unless they're cleaned and sanitized. This is a way that we can help prevent disease transfer because it transfers on our boots, it transfers on equipment pretty easily. Don't haul disease home. And essentially what this means, if you followed us through the whole series that we've been doing, this goes back to our presentation of buying a goat, where we talk about not buying animals from terminal markets. So things like auction houses, things like live markets. If you happen to go to a live market and you see a cute goat that you want to take home, it's not a good idea. These animals or animals with unknown disease status, where maybe the herd's not tested for disease status, and buying an animal and where you buy that animal from is all based on your level of risk, what you are willing to accept as your level of risk. But there are different avenues that we can purchase livestock from that lead to less disease, possible disease introduction into your herd than others. Okay. And then the other one is know the warning signs of infectious diseases, which we've explored tonight. We've talked about some of those infectious diseases. So knowing the warning signs and what to look out for can help you reduce the effect of it if it gets into your herd. Okay. So the next is keep records, especially if you're moving goats in and out. So keep track of the source where you've purchased those goats from, the number and their birth date. And they should be tagged if you bought them from a reputable breeder. So keep track of their tag numbers. That'll help you in the future as you go forward. Keep track of daily feed and water consumption. This isn't something necessarily that you'll put on paper, but something that you might observe. So if your animal normally eats a half a flake of hay and drinks a half a bucket of water, and then one day she's not, it's likely that there's something cooking in that animal system that's causing them not to eat and drink normally. What I would write down, however, is any vaccinations, medications, and vitamins that you're providing those animals, especially medications and vaccinations, because those two sometimes have withdrawal times on them. And what withdrawal times are is essentially on the label, it says, it cannot consume milk for 10 days, cannot consume meat for 30 days, for instance. And what that means is that once you dose the animal with that vaccine or that medication, that vaccine or medication stays within the animal system for that amount of time, such that if that meat or milk was tested, we could pick up that vaccine or medication, and it could have an effect on human health. So for those reasons, these pharmaceutical companies have done the hard work for us, and they've labeled the withdrawal times. So it's important to make note of those. And whenever you dose an animal with any of these, mark down when they're safe to either milk or send to slaughter. If you're going to do that, if they're just pets, we don't need to worry about it so much. But if we're going to use them for meat or milk, we want to make sure that we have information on that. Their past history is also important. So we want to think about keeping records of breeding dates, kidding dates. These are really important for some of those metabolic diseases that we discussed a couple slides ago, because, if we're running into a goat that looks a little fat and is showing pregnancy toxemia systems and isn't actually pregnant, maybe there's something else going on, for instance, right? So keeping track of these things is really helpful, as well as the date of the last FAMACHA exam. And FAMACHA is essentially that exam that helps us determine anemia of the animals. This should be done by all goat owners every 2 weeks or so during the grazing season. And keeping track of when those were done helps us determine the general health status of the animal in regards to the level of anemia that they may be experiencing. And that's not an all-inclusive list. There are obviously other things that we could add to that past history list. Oh, I see you've got some things here in the chat.
So we had a question about Zachary, I was thinking that you were referencing urinary calculi, but let me know if I was wrong. In general, if you castrate early, so earlier than 4 months, your animals can sometimes be more susceptible. The testosterone that the animal is producing actually helps influence the diameter. Sorry, I failed geometry. The diameter of the urinary tract. So when you castrate them earlier than that 4 months, they're losing that hormone that would drive the size of their urinary tract. So they're more susceptible to getting those blockages. However, I think that, in conversations that I've had with farms that do castrate early based on their management system, as long as you're monitoring the nutrition that you're feeding those wethers at that point, you can overcome that risk. And at the end of the day too, like with good management, the incident of that happening, regardless of whether or not those animals are castrated, is very low.
Right.
So if for whatever reason, your management style, your vet's recommendation, you are castrating earlier, I wouldn't let this stop you. I would just be aware that can helps increase the incidence of it.
Yeah. Thanks, Caitlin. All right, perfect. So, oops. All right, records. Yep. All right, so the final little bit I'm going to share is keep good air quality in the barn. So this is more of a concern if you have an older farm, older facility, maybe you have a bank barn. I think those are more common towards the southeastern part of the state, maybe New Jersey. I'm from Pennsylvania. We have a lot of bank barns in Pennsylvania, but essentially what that is that the animals live in the basement, which is essentially a root cellar, and that part of the facility doesn't get a lot of good airflow. It's pretty wet down there. So those are, your highest concern areas, but there are other facilities, you never want to hermetically seal a livestock facility. You always want to have airflow in and out to allow for moisture and air exchange. We're concerned about moisture because it contributes to things like coccidiosis. It could increase the risk of pneumonia. And then feces and urine deposition, of course, is always happening, increasing the amount of moisture in the air. And then we also have to worry about things like ammonia with high moisture. So essentially the feces and urine, well, it's mostly the urine, but turning into volatile ammonia, which is a gas which can harm the respiratory tract and the eyes of a lot of our livestock species. Mostly we see these issues occur in winter when we want to seal everything up, but we should always keep good airflow. It's better to have something cooler and dry than warmer and wet, just as a general rule of thumb. Of course, we want to keep things like drafts off of our animals, but yeah, otherwise we want pretty good airflow. And then just air circulation can be anything. It can be a barn inlet and fan system like we have pictured here from the poultry site. I know this is a poultry barn, but a similar ventilation system can be employed for a larger goat facility. Opening doors and windows, having ridge vents, so venting in the peak of the structure up here where air can go up into the attic and then move out. Open roof overhangs, all of that can contribute to good airflow. And then the final thought that I want to leave you with is that learning what is normal takes time. So observing your goats daily, saying, okay, I know that she's not doing right. I can't put my finger on what it is, but there's something going on with her, and making sure that you follow up on that. Observing the environment's always a good idea. So does the poop look runny? Does poop look solid? How is the air feeling? Is it tacky? Is it dry? Does it smell really bad? Is it okay? What is the environmental moisture? And how are the goats interacting within their environment? Because that can give us information about how they're eating, what they're eating, and how they are feeling. Okay, so we will go ahead and take a little bit of a breath.
I think we're actually going to have to skip the break, just looking at the time
That's fair.
and the length of the video. So as long as everybody's feeling good, we'll keep tugging along. But I will put up a poll right now, just kind of checking in to see how folks are doing. So this has 3 questions in it. The first one's just kind of asking if you've learned anything yet. And if not, don't worry, we've got 45 more minutes of stuff to throw at you. Whether or not you are interested in goat herd health. So it might be something where you're like, I'm just going to call my vet for everything. Or it might be something, you're feeling confident about being able to handle most things on your farm while working with your vet. And then if you'd like to learn more. I'll give it just one more second and we'll share this. So looks like everybody's learned something. Most people are interested in goat herd health, and everyone would like to learn more. So
excellent. We have the solution for you coming right up.
We do. So now we're going to transition to talking about hoof health, and it goes hand in hand with herd health because hoof health is actually one of the bigger health issues that we find with goats. So I'm go ahead and share this. And hopefully that's coming up okay. So when we think about hoof health, what we're going to talk about tonight are kind of 4 big buckets. So first, and always is going to be the most helpful, is actually preventing any issues from happening. If we can prevent issues, then we don't have issues to treat. Then we're going to have some videos of us actually hoof trimming goats. You can see how it looks, and you'll have access to those videos after tonight, so you can continue to watch those. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that we find related to hoof health, and round it up with what types of records we have to keep. So in general, hoof health is something that we can help manage or prevent by using some best management practices. And it's really important to prevent that because then we're not spending time and money treating hoof issues. And if animals have poor hoof health, it really does have a big effect on their well-being. So they're not going to be able to eat as much, they're in pain, and it can lead them, their immune system is decreased because they're trying to manage these hoof issues. So it can lead into other issues too. So we really do want to focus on prevention as much as we can. The best ways to prevent hoof issues are to regularly trim those feet. You'll hear every 6 to 8 weeks is like a management tool, but it really does depend on your actual herd and where they are. So some farms you might be trimming once a month if they're on a bedded pack, for example, and you're feeding them a high grain diet. And you might have other farms where they're, grazing in areas where there's a lot of rocks and roughage for them to climb around on. And you may only be trimming every 2 or 3 months. So in the very beginning, you're going to want to think about trimming once a month. And from there, you can adjust it as your herd needs it. The second thing that we can do to prevent any hoof issues is to feed them a balanced diet. So Amy showed you that slide of all of those metabolic issues that goats can run into. And we can manage some of the hoof-related metabolic issues by proper diet. The biggest thing that I see causing overgrown hoof issues or laminitis, which we'll talk about a little bit later, can be over feeding the goats too much grain. So work with your vet if you have issues with this. Read the labels on the feed products that you're feeding them. And sometimes treats aren't actually treats. So if you're overfeeding treats, that can throw off their mineral balances, and it can cause hoof issues too. So feeding a balanced diet that's heavy on forage is a good way to prevent hoof problems. And then finally, environmental fund. So depending on your housing, if you're able to put concrete blocks, big boulders, something that the goats can climb on that will naturally wear down their hoof, that will help prevent foot issues because it's being continually stimulated to grow new healthy tissue, and the goats are continually wearing down that old junky tissue. Also, if you have an area in your housing facility where you can put a foot tub, a foot bath tub. So this is a tub where the goat is standing in some type of a hoof solution to help prevent or treat any hoof issues that you can clean out and resupply regularly. So sometimes, this is in an alleyway where it's a closed area that you can put some type of a tub, or you have a way that you could put them into a foot bath if they need it. Any type of thinking about those environmental considerations. But I will never underplay the value of throwing a boulder in the middle of the field. So goats will climb on that and it will wear down their hooves, and you'll notice that you don't have to trim them as much. So we've got a whole bunch of videos that we're going to show you, and I apologize if I'm talking too fast. I just want to get to the videos because those are the good part. The first video that we're going to look at is putting together a hoof trimming kit. So similarly to last time's video about a kitting kit, it's helpful to have a designated area on your farm where you're keeping all of your hoof trimming materials. And that could be a tub, it could be a bucket, it could be whatever makes the most sense for you, but you keep everything in there together. So we're going to watch this first video. You know what? I think I need to stop my share. We're going to have to do it this way, guys. I'm sorry about the apologies for the tech glitch.
So now I'm going to show you.
Okay, there we go. So this first video is going to be about putting together.
So now I'm going to show you what types of supplies you might want to consider to keep on hand to trim goat feet. The first thing that we're going to want to think about is safety. So we're working with live animals that have horns and hooves, and we're working with sharp shears or hoof trimmers. And these can be really scary combinations. So some things that I like to keep on hand are some protective gloves. The difficult part with full leather, fully protective gloves is that it can be hard to maneuver the trimmers and the hooves at the same time. So what I like to use are plastic coated type gardening gloves, and I found that those protect me enough, but I'm still able to use the equipment in the way that I need to use it. Some other things that I keep on hand, I actually have overalls that I use. This helps give me a little bit of protection from getting a horn in my thigh, which hurts really bad. And if I accidentally slip with the trimmers, it'll protect me from cutting my legs. And then you're going to look really dorky while you're doing it, but I've gotten too many hoof trimmings in my eyeball, so I wear clear safety glasses just to protect. So as you're trimming, you've got hoof shards flying everywhere, and this can be really important to protect your eyes. Along with safety first, the next thing that I would consider using is a halter. If you have a stand that you can use to trim feet and perform other activities related to health maintenance on goats, you can use that. But if you don't have a stand, picking up a rope halter and finding a strategic corner can be really helpful. And in our video, we'll show you how you go about putting a halter on and catching a goat. The next thing that I try to keep on hand is just a bucket and some Epsom salts. So sometimes if goats are out on pasture, for example, or in the barn, their hooves might become really dirty over time, and it can make for a really hard situation to try to trim their hooves. So what I do is I usually put about a cup of Epsom salts into a bucket about this size with some very warm, not hot, but very warm water, and I'll let that goat soak her hoof for between 5 and 10 minutes, depending on how bad the hoof is. The other thing too is that if that hoof has any type of hoof rot, ulcer, puncture, the Epsom salts will soothe everything and you're not going to hurt anything. So 10 out of 10 recommend a big bulk bag of Epsom salts when it comes to any type of hoof trimming. The other thing that it does too is it does soften up the hoof. So if you have hooves that might be overgrown, you can actually soak them for even longer, so 15-20 minutes, and it'll help soften that hoof so that you're able to trim it a little bit more efficiently. So up next are the actual hoof trimming tools. So what I have here is a brush and a pick. You can use this to help clean the hoof if you need to, and to help pick any dirt or debris that might be in that hoof. These are a pair of what they call hoof rat shears. They're very heavy duty. They're meant to take off large snaps of hoof at a time. And to be honest, they were made for a man. So these are really hard to navigate depending on the size of your hand and the strength of your forearms. They work really well for some people. They don't work well for other people. Again, these are called hoof rat shears. The good news is that they're heavy duty and they will last forever. I use something that's a little bit smaller. They're just marketed as hoof trimmers. They work better at nipping, and you'll actually see these in use in the video. I do recommend spending a little bit more money on these than kind of what you can find for $10 or $15 at your farm supply store. These ones I think were around $50 or $60. And the blades, you're able to sharpen them over time and they just last a lot longer. So you will get your money's worth if you buy hoof trimmers that maybe are a little bit more expensive. Some other things to keep on hand. This is just some rubbing alcohol that I use to disinfect my hoof trimmers in between goats, so I'm not passing along any type of bacteria, hoof rot infection that might be there from goat to goat, and just keep my trimmers clean. And then plastic gloves. If you're not using protective gloves, sometimes we can get into some nasty hooves that smell bad, and that smell lingers on your hands for days. So plastic gloves can help to protect against that. So sometimes if you're working with a hoof that might have some type of hoof rot or hoof scald or some other type of sore issue, you might want to use a product that contains zinc. Zinc sulfate is in this product that I use. It's a hoof bath, hoof soaking type material. So what I do is I will essentially spray or drip this onto the hoof and keep that hoof off the ground for a few minutes to let it soak in. Zinc is really helpful for any type of hoof issues that we might run into. So now I'm going to show you
Okay, so a couple of things that weren't in that video. There are some other options that you have for tools to trim the hoof. Some people use pruning shears. So in some desperate moments when I haven't been able to find actual hoof trimmers, goat hoof trimmers, the beauty of Facebook, someone turned me onto buying pruning shears. So if you go to like the local hardware store, the shears that you would use, the pruners that you would use for like apple trees, they actually work well on goat hooves too. Most of them you can't sharpen, has been the difficult part. So if you've got the money and you can have a couple weeks to get it and order it online, I definitely recommend ordering a better quality trimmer that's designed for goat feet. The other thing that you can do, they do make rotary tools. So it's like a Dremel with a little disc, abrasive disc, where you can grind off those hooves. I definitely don't recommend those for beginners. They're definitely for the skilled folks that do this on a large scale. So for small goat herds, you absolutely can do your own hoof trimming, and you can buy all of these supplies for less than $100, including investing in really good hoof trimmers. So I definitely recommend, this is something that you can do on your own and don't have to pay somebody else to do it. And for less than $100, you can get the supplies that you need to get started. So the next thing that we're going to look at as far as hoof trimming is actually restraining the goat. We're going to show you in the video how to restrain a goat in a field setting so you don't have one of these stands. But if you do have access to a milking stand, which is what these are called, they're really helpful. The biggest thing with those is that you do have to train the goats to use them before you start hoof trimming them. This is one that somebody makes and sells on Etsy, so you can make them yourself out of some boards. You can also buy ones that are stainless steel from different ag companies. So those are an option. The advantage of a stand is that it gets the goats up in the air. So if you have any back issues, trimming feet is a really back intensive process. You're using a lot of strength and it does ache after a while. So having a stand can make it a little bit easier to manage the animal, and it makes it easier on your back. The biggest thing that I recommend when it comes to restraining animals is to go slow and quietly. So our worst thing that you can do is go into that pen and yell and try to catch that goat and get her all riled up right before you're coming at them with a pair of sharp pliers and expecting them to stand still. So quiet and carefully is the best way to do that. So right now we're going to show you a video of catching the goat out in the field.
Now we're going to work on catching some goats to hoof trim them. In a situation like this where these goats are out on pasture, it makes it a little bit trickier to try to catch them versus when they're in the barn. So we're going to show you what trimming would look like on a few different animals. These guys in particular did get trimmed before they were turned out to pasture, so their hooves won't be as overgrown as we might see when animals are outside and on pasture where they might have rocks or other things to kind of crawl on. We actually have some concrete blocks that they jump around on. It does wear their hooves down more than them being inside in the barn. So trimming isn't as necessary. But as you'll see while we're taking these videos, we have one that's limping. So we'll get to take a look and see what's going on with her. So the first thing that we're going to do is try to catch them as safely as we can. I probably am going to regret doing this on video, but it'll be okay. So you can see that in this pasture setup, we've got some hog panels that essentially create a little bit of a corral. What we do is we feed them here every day, so they're used to coming to this area, so it's not a big deal for them to come in here, and then I can kind of try to catch them. I am going to use a halter as my main restraining method, and in order to do that, I very calmly corner the goat. I will wrestle her. Essentially, I'll show you how that hold looks and put the halter on her, so wish me luck. Okay, so usually with goats, especially ones that might be a little bit more friendly, by the time you can kind of catch them around their neck and their heads, they kind of calm down. So all I'm doing right now is I have one hand that's underneath her chin, one hand that's on the other side of her neck, and I'm using my body weight to kind of push her to the side a little bit. This is just a simple rope halter. The way that I do it is I put the first part over their nose and then loop it around their ears. The reason that I do it that way is that then if they're trying to push out of it, the nose part's at least there. Okay, so it fits. The one loop goes around her two ears, one loop goes over the bridge of her nose, and then we tighten it up. And this is just meant as a way to restrain the animal. Now what I'm going to do, because I don't have a stand to trim on, I'm going to use the corner of our corral here as a way to hold her tight to one side. So I'll take the halter and I'll tie her to this pole right here. I'm just tying it at where her natural head height would be. If you tie it too high, they can hang themselves. If you tie it too low, they can essentially somersault over. So usually if we can hold it to where her natural head height would be, it just helps to keep her safe and it keeps me safe too.
So that is how you could kind of catch a goat if you don't have a great catch a goat setup. So we definitely recognize that the perfect setup isn't always something that we have right at the beginning. Now we're going to look at actually trimming hooves and seeing what that process looks like. basically what you're going to see in the video is the first thing you do is to kind of clean off any soil or manure or debris that might be on the hoof. Look at the hoof to make sure there's not any apparent problems. You start on the outer wall and then work your way in. So let's put that video up. And if this video is coming through grainy for you, no worries. I know sometimes broadband or internet access can be an issue. So don't worry, you're going to have access to all of these videos here. Go ahead and get this one started.
All right, so now we're going to work on hoof trimming. As you can tell, I'm not wearing my safety goggles or my safety overalls or my gloves that we talked about in the last video, so you'll have to forgive me for this, but I do have my clean, sharp clippers. As I mentioned, you know, it's a personal favorite for what types of clippers work best for you. For me, with the size of my hands, these ones work the best and are a little bit easier for me to handle. This mom is still nursing a kid that's going to be weaned very shortly, so the kid will kind of be around and we're just going to shoo her out of the way. And what we'll do is we will start with a back leg here. So because I don't have a stand, I'm going to use my body weight to gently push her against this hog panel. The hog panel is not very sturdy, so I don't want to push her too hard because it could flop over. I'm going to run my hand down her leg so she knows to expect my touch. And I'm going to pick her foot up. And I'm going to let her calm down for a second. And there we go. So you can see that this hoof is starting to get a little bit overgrown, which is great for today's purposes. Hoofs always grow from the outside. So you can see that the edges are getting longer. And then over time, the heels extend out as well. When we're looking at hoof health, we're just going to make sure that there's no soreness in between the two cloves. You can see that that is a healthy interdermal area. We can touch this and it doesn't seem like anything's sore or pussy or leaking. So this just looks like a typical overgrown hoof. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our clippers, and it's always best to go slow, just like you would cut a kid's fingernails. If you go too far, it'll hurt really bad. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by trimming down these edges that we can obviously tell are overgrown. I'm going to take small snips, and I'm going to try to get these edges level to the center of that hoof. Once I get that down a little bit, what I can actually do is this tip of the hoof, I can cut that off to a blunt edge. Again, taking small snips, and then continue to even up these outer hooves. Our goal is to get this flat. Doesn't always happen, but it's a good goal to have. Now that I'm starting to get down a little bit farther, I'm going to come to the back and take very small snips. You want to go until you start to see some pink flesh, and that's when we're going to stop, because that means that we're getting close to the nail bed. Oh, hold on, big girl. Okay, so you can just start to see it. We're not there yet, but getting a little bit closer. This is how much she likes this. So I'm going to come back here and take another small snip. And at this point, we're just going to try to even everything out. So you can see right here at this tip, there's just a little bit of pink. So that's as far as we're gonna go. Right there is where the blood vessels start. If we go any farther, we could risk injuring her hoof. But we wanna get as close as we can so that we're not trimming hoofs every single day. So knowing this is kind of my stopping point, I'm going to work backwards and just try to even everything out as best I can. Taking very small snips as we go along. This looks like might just be a growth of the hoof. So I'm going to trim that off so it doesn't get caught on anything. There we go. And I'd say for these purposes, that's pretty good. So now I'll do the other side a little bit quicker. And right here, oops, I just picked it out. That was just debris. So you can use the edge of your pliers to clean that out if that gives you a better sight line. Careful. Okay, and there you go. Sometimes you'll get the outer edges lower than the middle, and that's okay. The biggest thing that we're trying to do is just go for the best we can get, especially because these goats are out on pasture where they can rub their hoofs down. That middle part will rub down on its own. And if you look at it from this side, you can see that we've cut down quite a bit of that heel, and the front's a little bit more blunt, and this will give her a more even spot to walk on. These ones, the dew claws, if they get too long, you can trim them. It doesn't affect the health of the animal at all, so I leave them alone. And that's her back hoof.
Okay. I find that incredibly satisfying to watch a hoof get trimmed, mostly because I'm not out there right now bending over in the hot sun trying to trim feet. So now we're going to watch one more video of a front leg. What I wanted to stop and tell you about before we start this is that I'm purposefully holding the foot backwards than I normally would to help us when we were trying to take this video. So the way that my hand is, it's actually in front of where I'm snipping, which for anybody with a little bit of common sense, that's not the way you want to do it because you're increasing the risk of accidentally cutting your fingers. So just keep that in mind.
Now
just keep that in mind as we're watching this video.
Show you front hoof. It's basically the same thing. We're just going to pick it up a little bit differently because of where the knee joint is. And then because I am doing this by myself without a stand, I just have to be careful with where I'm putting my body weight against her as a way to kind of stabilize her. So what I'll actually do is I'll turn around because of how she's set up, and I'm gonna do the same thing, rub my hand down her leg and bend it like this. And you'll see that this hoof looks very similar. So we've got the outer edges kind of overgrown. This heel has grown a little bit over the season, so we'll work on trimming it same way. So I'm going to do small snips on the outer edges. You can see right here, so this is why we hoof trim. This area, there is some debris that's starting to get down in that hoof in between the outer edge and the inner edge of the hoof. If we weren't trimming, that would be left in there and it could turn into an infection, an ulcer, or just make her feet sore over time. So once I've got kind of my outer edges clipped down to where I want them, I'm going to do that blunt cut at the front, cut down some of the middle, and then I'll go to work on the heel. So same thing, small snips at a time. We're going to try to get the heel down until we see some flesh color, and then that's where we're going to stop. If we get to a spot where we can't quite get a grip on some to trim, you can go back up. Oh, So you saw on that one, I probably grabbed too big of a slice and it was getting to a spot where it's going to hurt her. That's why she picked her foot up out of the way. So that gives me a clue that I might be getting close there. So I'm going to be careful there. Goats will tell you when you're getting too close. Okay, I'm going to keep trimming this one down just a little bit. And same thing as on the back ones. If the center of the hoof is a little bit humped up from your outer edges, that's okay. It'll wear down over time. And you can see right here, right on the inside of this hoof, we're just getting to some blood vessels. So I'm going to stop up in this area. And I think we'll call that good enough. So same thing on the other side, just going to go a little bit quicker. You can see here, she's just got some woody perennial debris, so we can pick that out so we can see what we're doing. Going to trim off these outer edges. And yes, you should absolutely be wearing protective gloves for this so you don't snip your finger off. Do as I say, not as I do. And we're going to take that blunt cut off the front. Keep working our way down. And we'll call that just about good enough. So the biggest thing that we're trying to do is to keep those outer edges pinned down. They'll wear down this middle part of the heel as they walk on it, but what happens over time is these outer edges grow over the middle of the hoof, and then this just creates a space that gets infected and rot and really sore for them. So we just want to keep these outer edges trimmed down. We can check in between our toes. Everything looks okay on this one. Dew claws look okay. Skin looks okay. And if you look at her standing on it now, you can see it's a lot flatter, trimmed up nicely.
All right, as I'm getting our presentation back up, if anybody has any questions so far, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I think that covered the one thing that we didn't actually talk about in the video is that sometimes the heel, usually the heel does not grow as fast as the outer wall and the sole. So sometimes you might think, well, I don't need to trim that. But what can happen over time, and you saw it just a tiny bit in that goat, is the hoof can get cracked or the heel can get cracked, just like people's feet, right? Like the bottom of your feet can get cracked. And those cracks are places that bacteria, rocks, mud can hang out in, and it can cause some hoof issues down the road. So even if the heels look okay, it still is good to trim them. Then that, signals to the goat's body to start regrowing that nail, and it'll grow healthy tissue. So it's always good to continue to trim, even if it doesn't look terrible yet. So now we have another poll. This one's just for fun. So we're wondering, what part of the safety gear are you most excited about looking weird in? So my husband always picks on me, but I absolutely love my railroad conductor overalls because they're comfy, have a zillion pockets, and they stop goat trimmers. That makes me feel good. Scratchy safety glasses, safety gloves. One thing that wasn't in the kit is headlamps. So a lot of times in the winter, if the animals are in the barn, it can be hard to see where you're trimming. So that's always good, or something else that you'll type in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to end this and share it. And looks like we've got some overall people and some headlamp people, and you people are my people. So welcome. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about, we watched hoof trimming. We talked about kind of the key concepts. The best thing that you can do is just go ahead, jump in and get started. If you're going small snips and you're going slow, you're not going to hurt the goat. So now these are kind of some what if situations. What do you do if, bad things happen? The first thing is, what do you do if the hoof bleeds? And the best thing is to not panic. You will get to hooves that bleed. Some of those blood vessels might be closer to the surface than other animals, and that's okay. So what you should do in that situation is apply pressure to the part that's bleeding. If it's bleeding pretty good, you can use some type of blood clotting powder. You can keep that in your kit, or you could use corn starch in a pitch. That'll help stop the blood too. It's always good to know what the tetanus status, vaccination status of your animals are. That is an open wound, and typically they're out in pasture, so tetanus is an issue. But if your animals are up to date on their vaccinations, and the bleeding has stopped and you've allowed it to clot, you can let the animal go back into its housing without bandaging it up at all. Just monitor them closely for any continued issues. If, as you're hoof trimming, you find some rotten tissue, and you'll know when you find it because it smells disgusting. It smells like rotten hoof tissue. What you should do is clean up your tools with rubbing alcohol or bleach to make sure you're not passing that in between different animals or in between that animal's hoofs. And then you can treat that hoof specifically by keeping the hoof trimmed and using something that contains zinc, which we talked about earlier. So, I use that zinc sulfate spray bottle. You can use a zinc foot bath, which you could just, find some zinc, order some zinc sulfate, work with your vet to get some, mix it with water to make a foot bath, put it in a pail or a coffee can, and let the goat's hoof soak in that for 10 to 15 minutes. And you should do that daily for a week or two. And as long as the hoof rot isn't too bad, that will clear it up. If the hoof is too hard to cut through, so this can sometimes happen on older animals, that their hooves are naturally a little bit harder than younger animals, or if it's been a long time since you've trimmed hooves, what you should do is sharpen your trimming blades. That will make it easier. You can tell as soon as those blades are getting dull because they just won't cut through anything. You can soak your hoof, like we talked about earlier, in like an Epsom salt bath or just water, and then try smaller snips. So sometimes if you try to go to get a big chunk of nail clipped off, it's harder to clip through. So it'll always be easier. It seems like it takes a lot longer, but it might not. But just do small snips after small snips after small snips and work your way down. And then if the hoof is really overgrown, don't expect to make it look perfect that first time through. So in some situations where the hoof might have gotten way overgrown, what you might end up doing is trimming them once a week for a month and just doing a little bit at a time to help wear that hoof down. If you have a severely overgrown foot and you try to trim it down to where it should be, those blood vessels that are in that foot actually extend as the hoof continues to grow. So you're going to end up with a big bloody mess. So it's always best to just trim until you get to that pink tissue and then stop. A week later, trim until you get to pink tissue and stop. And you'll get there. If it takes you a little while, that's okay, but it's better than letting the goats run around with 4 bloody hooves or kind of breaking your back over trying to get that hoof caught up. Some issues that come along with hoof care, we've talked a lot about foot rot or foot scald because it is it's one of the most common issues. It's contagious. It's caused by naturally occurring soil bacteria, but it can also be passed from goat to goat, from herd to herd. You can treat it by trimming. If it's a really bad case, you can use antibiotics with the guidance of your veterinarian, but the best thing you can do is prevent it. So you can prevent hoof rot by foot scald with actively monitoring for it, purchasing animals that don't have hoof rot, and trimming regularly. The last video that we're going to show you, this is a video of some very, very early hoof scald that we just happened to catch that day that we were out trimming feet. So she, for example, I gave her, with the guidance of my vet, 1 shot of an antibiotic, did a zinc sulfate bath for a week, trimmed that down, and it's healed at this point. So we're going to keep an eye on her, but we caught it really early, which is good. So we'll show you what this video looks like. The thing to look for is the tissue that's in between the 2 cloves of the hoof that's where the infection usually starts.
We noticed that this goat has been limping on her left front foot. We have no idea what's going on with it. We're going to take a look at it. Usually we want to make sure that we're looking at our goats every day so that when we notice that they might be limping or something might be up, we can take a look at it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spin her around. And it's on her front leg. Run my hand down, pick her foot up, and we'll take a look. So the first thing I like to check is just to make sure that these outer parts are overgrown. Sometimes if they get overgrown, they can get just infection or something stuck inside. These haven't overgrown. You can see where they're just starting to. So this is the time that I would start trimming them. Next thing I look for is just any visible injury to the hoof. Sometimes they can get a puncture from a piece of wire. Rock can get stuck. That can cause a limp. I'm not seeing anything at first glance either. So the next thing that I look for is in the skin, in between the toes. Sometimes that can get not full hoof rot, but hoof scald is what they call it. And it's kind of like probably close to athlete's foot if you wanted to think about something like that. So it's wet, moist, bacteria can grow in here, and it can cause an infection in the skin. So I'm going to very carefully hooves apart. And if you can see that, you can see that her hooves are a little red in between the two hooves. So this would
just to show you this spot right in here. As the video continues, you'll see that it's moist and it looks a little bit irritated. As hoof rot continues, you can definitely tell, but in this situation, this is the very beginning of it. So we're looking right in here.
Would be the very, very beginnings of hoof scald. And if you look at the back, which is even, you can see that they're white, moist, and kind of have like a little bit of a pussy look, even though it's not pussy, but that's so it does look like there's some sore in between those two hooves. Again, that's just the beginnings of hoof scald. So the way that we'll treat this is we'll trim it down. We will, I usually do an Epsom soak that we'll talk about later. Give her some type of something with it and keep an eye on that hoof moving forward. Make sure we're keeping it trimmed down.
Okay, so some other issues that sometimes come up, laminitis, which Amy alluded to earlier, also called founder. It can affect the hooves if it gets bad enough. What it does is it makes the hooves kind of swell up. That hoof tissue swells up and it's really painful. You can usually manage it by changes in the diet and watching your grain intake. Goats can also get abscesses in their feet. So this typically happens if they get some type of a puncture wound. So a rock gets caught in their foot, they step on a nail, step on a twig, and then that puncture wound creates an area for bacteria to get in, and that creates an abscess. It's very painful. Usually they can get really big really quickly, and you usually treat it by trimming it down to kind of expose that abscess and using an internal antibiotic so that to kill off the bacteria that's causing the abscess. Depending on the severity, that is a situation where your vet might recommend that you wrap that to avoid it from getting reinfected as they're out in the field, depending on the size of the abscess and where it is. There's also something called a granuloma. This is caused by an injury and a buildup of scar tissue around that injury. It creates red, swollen tissue that bleeds a lot. That's what this picture is. Amy, this was confirmed by the vet. So we found this in a goat and we've been monitoring it, trying to figure out what it is, and got vet confirmation that it's a granuloma. To treat this, it just same thing, Epsom salt soaks, foot baths, and continued trimming until it grows itself out. Those are kind of the major issues that we see most often with hoof care. And we're just telling you this, not expecting you to be a vet, but so you know, if you start trimming feet and you are running into these are probably what it is. Last thing is record keeping. Amy's already talked about record keeping, some things to think about as far as hoof trimming record keeping. Pictures are great. So in the example before, Amy and I found this in a goat. We're wondering what it was, going back and forth. Could it be this? Could it be that? And I was able to text this picture to a vet and say, hey, what is this? Oh, it's a granuloma. Here's what you do. Perfect. Thank you. So pictures are always wonderful to have on hand if you have them. And then if you give any types of treatments, so if you give an antibiotic, you need to record that. Who was the goat? How much did they get? When did they get it? Some treatments have withholds on them. And then the last thing that record keeping helps with is to notice if there's patterns. So for example, you might find that you are trimming feet more often when they're in the barn on a bedded pack. So that's something for you to keep in mind. You also might notice that if it's really muddy, you all of a sudden are seeing some more goats with hoof rot or hoof scald. And that's something to think about next year when you're turning goats out to pasture. And then the final thing is that sometimes genetic lines can be more susceptible to hoof issues. And it's important to note that. So if it gets to the point where you're, investing a lot of time and energy into a genetic line of goats and they're continually suffering from hoof problems, sometimes it's easier to cull that line out of your herd or start over with some better stock. With that, we have our last poll that we're going to put up and would ask that you guys put any questions or comments that you have. And our final poll, we will have a follow-up survey that pops up at the end of this, and we want to know whether or not you're going to fill it out. You'll notice that the answers are all yes. So we really hope that you fill that follow-up poll out. We do have some questions if you've got topics or other things that you want to learn about. We will absolutely work with FarmOps to continue to offer these webinars for you. So we will open it up to the chat now. If anybody has any questions or things that they would like to talk about, please go ahead and fill those in. Amy, if you have anything to add about hoof health, go ahead and do that. I was kind of running through because I knew those videos were the good stuff. So
yeah, they are. And I think that you really, we through this presentation, we've really encompassed the 30,000 foot overview of foot health. Of course, as you go through, as Caitlin mentioned, there's going to be all different scenarios that you're going to come across, and that is just how we learn. And farming is a year by year thing, right? So whatever doesn't work this year, we can try something different next year. If it doesn't work that year, we work again and we do it the next year. So have heart. If something doesn't work out year one, you'll fix it and do better year two.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we talked about in the last webinar too, is it's really helpful to have farmer friends. So if you find something weird, you can text them a picture and say, hey, my goat is doing this weird thing, or this is what my goat's eyeball looks like. What do I do? Because there's a lot to be said about experience too, and camaraderie and learning with each other.
Yep, for sure.
All right, so I'm not seeing any questions at this point. From here, we will be sharing out the recording, the slides, and the resources, along with the links to the videos. So you can watch them again. And that should be coming out tomorrow. And this is the last of our scheduled webinars for right now, but we have all of your email addresses. So as we continue forward, we'll share those with you. Once we get into the fall and winter season, we'll be offering some more on this topic. Amy, anything else to add?
Nope. Well, one small thing, I suppose, because there's always that one small thing, right? So just thank you guys so much for your interaction and staying with us week over week and asking some really brilliant questions. We all learn together through that method, and it helps us break up the presentations. It's just a lot of fun. So thank you guys for being awesome.
Okay, so I just put the survey link in the chat if you want it. It will also pop up after you close out the Zoom window. And with that, thank you for your time, and we hope to see you guys virtually soon, and good luck on all of your goat adventures. And if you do end up purchasing goats, please send Amy and I pictures, because we love goat pictures. So take care, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night.